Hey everyone, welcome to my presentation. We're going to talk about Killer Instinct and some of the adventures I had with trying to make it a little bit more accessible to gamers without sight. Right, so who the hell am I? My name is Zachary Quarles. I started in the industry at Raven Software in the year 2000, and I worked as a developer for 12 years until I joined Microsoft Game Studios as a publisher in 2012. This is some of the companies that I either worked at as a developer or worked with as a publisher. Okay, so Killer Instinct was rebooted in 2013 at Microsoft with the developer Double Helix taking the realm. It was my task to kind of keep track of the audio mix, and the top priorities were given to have three key forms of player feedback. The first one being giving damage, second one being receiving damage, and third one, blocking damage. Those became kind of the three primary filters that all things audio filtered through. Over the course of development, I became more and more involved with the mainstream gamers without sight community and accessibility as a whole. In fact, I joined the Microsoft Gaming for Everyone group as a content lead. A gamer by the name of Sightless Combat reached out to me with some feedback and requests to help KI become more accessible over the course of its development lifetime. He and I would often chat via social media circles, and I would either implement changes and requests as it was appropriate, or take his feedback to the team to see what we could handle from a feature standpoint if I couldn't handle it through content or just from implementation alone. Between the initial audio pillars and directives that were established at the beginning of the project, the continued growth as it matured, and the work that Sightless and I have done, KI has become a much more accessible game than many out there. Now, is it perfect? Absolutely not. There's plenty of room to grow, but I do believe that it has become a pretty good springboard for discussions on best practices and some ideas that some game teams can keep in mind as they're kind of developing their experience. All right, so over the course of KI's development, there are many things that we did that worked pretty well. There are some that needed a little bit of improvement, but at the end of it all, I came away with several ideas that I think were important to consider beyond just the KI franchise and to improve game accessibility as large. The following points we'll focus on from here on out will be what worked, awesome, what needed improvement, meh, and what to think about in the future. So, starting off with what went right, the audio mix. The game went through several incremental mixes after each release, and then we did a major remix after every season to make sure everything was working well with each other. The initial mix of Season 1 happened right before launch of the Xbox One, and that's when we really established the idea of giving, receiving, and blocking damage as a primary feedback filter. As the game matured, we continued to nuance the mix. We started to prune out certain aesthetic details back in favor of stronger player feedback and a more focused mix. We also started to zero in on player movement as a whole to focus to allow gamers without sight to tell where they were in the battle arena while they were in combat. So footsteps, jumps, jump lands, Foley movements, backland slams, these were all brought up in the mix. Ambient loops, sweetener layers that didn't really provide strong player feedback, that sort of stuff, we backed that off just a little bit. So this allowed for a very layered soundscape, but we really wanted to focus on the individual characters, make sure that the player could tell where they were and what they were doing at any given time, and then anything outside of that was just gravy. So another thing that went right was audio panning. With KI, it's basically a 2.5 fighter. So it's not a full 3D, you're on a 2D plane. So what we ended up doing was we split the screen into three kind of sections. We had left, center, and right. And when a player passes through one of these sections, we do an aggressive hard pan on their location to make sure that the player can track where they are in the battle arena at any given time from just audio. When you first listen to this might seem a little drastic, but once you get into the match, it starts to feel natural, particularly over headphones, because you're able to really decipher where each player is and as they're transitioning through the play space. Likewise, when we're in like the UI section of character selection screens and menu selections, we hard pan anything in player 1 over to the left, and we hard pan anything player 2 to the right. It gives a very clean and distinct method of letting the player know who's selecting what. Now, something else that went right was sidechain compression, sort of. KI is not a subtle game by any stretch. If anyone's played it, you're constantly punching people with a massive musical score that's pulse pounding your head off, an announcer that's screaming their guts out. So there's nothing subtle about it whatsoever. It's full spectrum, everything's dialed to 11, and everything's happening very, very quickly. So I needed to figure out clever methods of carving out headroom to allow the important stuff to pop and the less important content to kind of duck away when it wasn't imperative. So KI use is wise, but when we were releasing it, this was before HDR. So we needed to figure out a method to basically get the benefits of HDR with what was existing in Wise at that point in time. So enter sidechain compression. So the audio nerds here, you know what I'm going to say. For the developers and for anyone online, the basic idea of sidechain compression is it has two inputs. One is the signal to be processed, while the other is to control the compression. So think of a pop music song when you have like a synth pad that's just kind of going, and then you have a kick drum going, the boom, the boom, the boom, the boom. What you want to do is basically use the amplitude of the kick drum to duck the synth pad, so you have a very focused kind of mix of boom, 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 boom. So you're able to kind of hear everything very focused. And you just got some beatboxing, so you're welcome. So now to put this into game terms, we needed to build a bus hierarchy that would track multiple game states, duck certain buses based off of what was happening. And so like if someone would get punched, what we wanted to do is duck the music slightly for the duration of that punch, so it would pop out of the mix and have more impact, and therefore be heard a little bit more clearly. So in order to get this set up, the problem with this was that it took a huge amount of manual setup, because there's so many different components moving in KI at any given time. And Mr. Jed, who is the audio lead and was the senior sound designer for KI Season 1, he was at Double Helix, who's now acquired by Amazon. He did just a ton of research and experimentation on this, and as we were kind of working on it, I think we counted that at some point KI lives around 112 buses to sub-buses, somewhere around there, which sounds absurd for a fighting game, but, and you'll see how absurd it is right now. So here's kind of a structure of it. You can see that any one of those lines will point to a different bus, and it just goes down forever. I wish I would have gotten like an animated GIF of me just scrolling through the whole thing, but that probably would have taken half of my presentation. But yeah, it's insanity. It's really cool. Something else that went right was menu options. We allowed a lot of player freedom to customize their aural experience with KI. It is common practice to provide volume options to turn music up and down in concert with sound effects and voiceover, but we also allowed the player to adjust the volume of ambient sounds, of the announcer volume, what type of announcer you wanted to do. We had 3 different options for the announcer. But another thing that we ended up doing was a particular option that turned on accessibility-specific content. And this mirrored some visual components that would happen in the game that had no initial audio feedback. So it was a thing that what we wanted to do, we didn't want it to distract from the mainline game, but for people without sight, they would be able to hear all status of where a player was, where they were about to basically blow out of a combo, and that side of things. All this stuff is turned off by default, but it gives the option of the player to leverage this specific content. And I have a little bit more info on this here pretty soon. Okay, so what else worked? Content was a pretty big one. There I am playing with fire. Boom. One of the best ways to make a game accessible to gamers without sight is having strong content that people recognize at a moment's notice. And one of the primary audio pillars for KI was to make sure that anyone could tell which 2 players were playing each other, even if they weren't standing in the same room. So we wanted to make sure that, like, if someone was playing as Glacius and someone was playing as Cinder, your mom in the living room would be like, oh my God, Cinder's really kicking his ass. So that's kind of what we wanted to do. That's exactly how my mom sounds too. Okay, next up was the announcer. Over-top announcer. The KI Legacy's always had this over-the-top announcer that's screaming at the top of its lungs. So insofar as that this became a tactic for them to bring people in that were walking by the arcade. they'd have this crazy announcer going, "Ultra Combo!" And people would be like, "What the hell is that?" And wander in and see what was going on. And while that is awesome, it also provides valuable feedback to the player during a match and keeps you updated on how you or your opponent is doing. It'll give you information about when you've successfully done a combo, what strength of combo you've achieved, if you're getting close to death, if you've done something spectacular in the match, etc. It's basically the voice of God narrating your story in this fight. Next up was dynamic music, and I'm not gonna hit on this too much in this talk, given the time constraint, because it is a very involved music system that we did for KI. But Jed and Mick Gordon, who is the composer for seasons 1 and 2, they did a talk on this at GDC a couple of years ago, and I'd recommend checking it out because it's really rad. But I mean, from a high level standpoint, you do at least. We show that when a match is started, when you're in normal combat, when you've gone into a combo, when you're blown out of a combo, when you're close to death, and when a match ends. There's also a significant system in place when a player goes into the ultra combo system, where every impact becomes a musical hit, and that creates a small character-specific piece of music as sort of like a reward at the end of a particularly badass match. All right. So what needed improvement? Resources and time. So this is something that plagues all games. We always want more time and we always want more resources. But at its peak, KI was releasing a new character every month. And this included a full sound design suite, voiceover casting, recording, implementation, stage ambience, stage destruction, a unique music set. You throw in promotional trailers, new game modes, balance adjustments, which usually added new moves to existing characters, the ultra combo hits, which were substantial. You had a really tight schedule. Each character averaged around 1,000 bespoke assets, and that did not include stage audio. We didn't have a dedicated audio programmer, and our audio staff was very, very lean. I think at most we were 3, maybe. This meant we were not able to fully realize some of the accessibility features and audio polish tasks that we were really pushing for in the end. Okay, so next up, something that would have helped was menu navigation. We had plenty of menu options that people could use, but getting to those options was a little tricky, particularly if you were a gamer without sight. Well after the initial release, after KI, the Xbox platform team provided an SDK for speech synthesis that would narrate components of your game experience. So wiring this into your UI system would allow gamers without sight to know exactly what menus they were on at any given time. It would narrate it out to you. As it stands right now, blind gamers will have to memorize by trial and error through the menu system, which obviously isn't ideal. So we could have done bespoke content for all of this menu navigation instead of using shared assets if we would have had more time and resources. But at the end of the day, that still would have required a lot of trial and error on the user's part to actually figure out what those bespoke assets were attached to. Okay, so this is something that didn't necessarily go wrong. It was just something that we didn't have time to implement. Leveraging Wise's HDR audio system would have vastly simplified our ridiculous complex bus structure. At a basic level, HDR audio is a sliding scale of audio priority. I'll just give this for the people in the room that haven't used HDR before. So it's a sliding scale, so when something loud occurs in the mix, the sliding scale will move to that decibel level and push anything under that scale into silence. So in the context of KI, if you're standing in this battle arena and there's waterfalls all around you and bugs are chirping and there's cold wind whipping around, you'll hear that soundscape just fine. And then once an opponent throws a fireball at you and explodes in your face, the HDR sliding scale will spike up to the fireball explosion, push all that ambient audio into silence until the explosion tapers off. And once the explosion starts to dissipate, the ambient soundscape starts to fade back in. So this all happens automatically. You don't have to have an overly complicated bus structure where some random setting that's buried in that spider web of ridiculousness would cause an issue of something like not ducking properly, or even worse, like not coming back from the mix, which we did have a bug of that after, I think, the season 1 release, that we found a couple of things that we needed to tweak from there. So moving over to the HDR system wasn't the plan for KI, but changes to staff and schedule and resources just didn't make it possible. It just would have been too risky to pull the existing system out and put something else in without the proper amount of time and resource. Okay, so let's talk about the future. What can we start thinking about and implementing and making our games more accessible? I'm not just talking about KI, I'm talking about all of us as an industry. First up, test your games with gamers without sight. This might seem elementary, but you will be amazed by what you discover when someone cannot rely on the visuals of your game. Take copious notes, ask questions. Better yet, take the time to build a relationship with the blind gaming community. Open yourself up to conversations and don't take notes personally. They're making your game better and they're taking the time to help, so be mindful and appreciative. In addition to all that, do yourself a favor and play your game blindfolded. You'll be surprised about what you miss in your own mix. I sat down and played a few rounds with sightless combat, and it was incredible what my ear picked up on that I thought was important, which had no bearing. And then he stomped me into the dirt. It was amazing. Okay, so what's next? Always be thinking about your audio mix. It's always tempting to make sure that everything is a delicious treat for the ears, but sometimes having too many elements working at the same time can cause confusion and will muddy up the waters. What's the most important information that you need the player to hear? Find that core pillar of your game and mix around that. Don't try to compete with it. And for the sound nerds in the room, be wary of avoiding the center channel. Some games will basically keep the center channel reserved for dialogue or special case audio. Be cautious of this. This is actually something that I came across with Sightless, that they often rely on the center channel to give a sense of where they are in the world. So if they're panning around and that ambient bed takes a pocket in the center, they'll get discombobulated very, very quickly. So that's something just to keep in mind. If it's something that in your audio vision, you're married to that idea, think about having a menu option that you're able to adjust the level input from your center channel. It really does help. What else? Content. Content isn't necessarily about making the coolest sounding sound that ever sounded, although that does help, and it's always the hope. It's about being identifiable and relatable to the player, which is grounded in the world that the game is taking place in. Can you tell what the game sound signifies in the context of your game? This can be as simple as a signature sound of a player brushing up against building geometry. It's not the sexiest sound in the world, but if you have that interaction of player versus geometry, someone without sight can explore your world so much more effectively. They have an understanding of where they are and where they can go. What to think about in the future, more player options. So multiple volume sliders, access to unique accessibility content, turning narration on and off. All of these are excellent components to have in your toolbox and make your game more accessible. One other feature that I think is a pretty simple solve is to have an initial setup for accessibility. So this would basically be a main menu pop-up the first time you start your game that would have all of the accessibility options on and would allow the player to say, yes, I want this on, or no, I want this off. And then have that option in a sub-menu if you need to make changes down the road. Alternatively, there would be a method of leveraging your platform settings. So if you set your console or your PC up from the very beginning, it would remember those settings and it would be part of your user data from there on out. I'm going to touch briefly on new tech, but not going to dive into it. As Guy was saying, spatial audio, such as Windows Sonic and Dolby Atmos, is providing a new opportunity for accessibility. That's height-based audio, so you're able to start tracking up and down as opposed to left and right, well, in addition to left and right. Other stuff like advanced obstruction, occlusion, acoustic, and audio reflection technologies make your game sound spectacular, but they also provide some pretty key feedback when it comes to gamers that may not be able to see the world around them. So in wrapping up, Killer Instinct certainly isn't the perfect example of a fully accessible game. Readily admit that. There are many components that KI are not accessible at all. There are some features that are not fully realized or implemented, but we as an industry have a lot to learn about this. And I think there are multiple avenues to explore beyond just audio. There are visual things like having varied options in terms of visual contrast, more options with color blindness, detailing accessibility features whenever the marketing story comes out, like how people know if a game is accessible or not, providing simplified controlled methods, varied difficulty levels, multiplayer options, adjustable font sizes, coming up with echolocation systems. These are all elements worth exploring. If you haven't perused the game accessibility guidelines webpage, I highly encourage you to do so. Let's make our games fun for everyone. For gamers without sight and experience with sightless, how much of that was memorization versus first-time experience sort of thing. Sightless is a really great gamer. He's a really, really good player, and I think there is some trial and error there just in terms of navigation of how to get into the game, but once he's in the game, I think a lot of it did come down to how the game sounded and how he was able to track stuff. A lot of his feedback was actually pretty minimal. He had a lot of small feature requests that built up to a lot of stuff and pointed me to an alternate mix of the game. And that really focused down to Foley movement and jumps and stuff like that, because he was able to track based off of footsteps. He wanted that volume of the footsteps just a little bit higher. And jumps, we had kind of whooshes that would track like based off of that audio panning and everything. And the jump lands, those were like the three really big ones for him. And then there are a whole bunch of like edge case sort of things. There's like this move was canceling out and I didn't know what the hell it was and that kind of thing. So I think a lot of it was him being a pretty strong gamer and experiencing a game and playing it as anyone else would, you know, and getting better over time through gameplay and not necessarily through memorization or anything. Watching some of his videos online, you can see him kicking some ass, and it's against people that can see. You know, it's pretty awesome. Second part of the question was, are there games out there that are audio only, or are we getting to a point to be able to do that? Well, technology and how to get there to audio-only games. There are some there now. They are kind of fringe case kind of stuff. There's a lot of mods out there. I remember a mod on the Doom 3 technology that was all audio-based. It was a survival horror game that was only audio. So I think that stuff is readily available. I think spatial audio will probably be the biggest sort of component of that. I think obstruction and occlusion plays a huge role with that, to be able to know where you are in a space and being able to decipher if something's behind a wall or not, and advanced reflections of being able to basically be able to track where a sound is reflecting from based off of the occlusion. I think those three are the keys. And just strong design. What are some of the best technologies for occlusion and obstruction? It's interesting. We're doing a lot of internal stuff at Microsoft that we're kind of playing around with. That's pretty exciting. Off-the-shelf sort of stuff. I haven't had to use it for KI for 3 years, so I'm kind of behind the curve on what's available off the shelf right now. But I am pretty aware of what's going on internally, and there'll be more info on that in the future. So we have had experiences with both, and part of the Gaming for Everyone crew at Microsoft, my primary focus is accessibility and working with people that were born without or that had recently lost. And I'd talked to someone that had lost their sight a few years ago, and they were a very strong gamer beforehand, and what that change, you know, what that involves. It's not an easy solve by any stretch for something like that, for someone that does have that connection to vision acuity. But the experience, I think, at the end of the day is similar in terms of what the gameplay experience is and how to approach that, in my opinion, at least right now. I'm certainly not an expert at this right now. I'm learning a lot as I go. Probably ablegamers.com would be a good one. Ablegamers would be a good starting point. If you want to send me an email at some point, I can shoot you some more resources. And I do recommend checking out, just as developers, this site. It's really, really cool. There's a lot of info there. The Game Accessibility Guidelines page. Definitely check it out. Definitely start thinking about it as you're developing your games and approaching your audio direction, because it'll change your life. Thanks, y'all.